With great power comes great responsibility.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, how we doing? Good. So, last video, it was the 1960s, and the 1960s in the Cold War is a time of immense concern, right? Like the world came this close to basically hitting the buttons and saying bye-bye forever. So the 1960s represents this Cold War phenomenon known as brinkmanship, where the tension between the Soviet Union and the United States of America keeps going up and up and up until eventually we're on the brink of nuclear war. That's not good because nuclear weapons have the capacity to change life as we know it on this planet. So after the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world grows weary of the constant threat of nuclear annihilation, and that leads us into the 1970s. In the 1970s, we have two new leaders leading the Cold War. In America, we have President Richard Nixon, and in the Soviet Union, we have Leonid Brezhnev, famous for his incredibly bushy eyebrows. And if I didn't have beautifully manscaped eyebrows, I would fluff them up for you, but no, my wife's on me all the time about my eyebrows, so sorry about that. Anyways, so yeah, 1970s, guys, is an era known as détente in the Cold War. So number 29 says, explain the Cold War political action known as détente. Okay, when I think détente, we think of generally as opposite of brinkmanship. If brinkmanship is the increasing of tension over time, then détente is the decreasing of tension over time. So beginning in 1972, we start to see goodwill between the United States and the Soviet Union and also China, right? The two big communist nations of the world. Now, number 29 says, what was significant about Nixon's visit to China during the détente period? Well, Nixon was the first American president to visit the Communist People's Republic of China. And of course, this comes after the historic ping-pong diplomacy that happened in 1971. So in 1971, the American ping-pong team is invited to a ping-pong summit in China, and an American delegate went to this summit. There was ping pong players, obviously, but there's also a media contingency, and they recorded and documented life in the otherwise very secluded People's Republic of China. Up to that point, guys, there had been about 23 years of media silence in the United States of America regarding China. Not a lot was known about this communist nation, and here we had all of a sudden this opening of relations between the United States and China, and this is good for world peace, right? While Nixon was in China, he met with Chairman Mao. Nixon's wife, Pat, she went to hospitals, she went to schools, toured different cities, as did Richard Nixon. And it taught Nixon, or the Nixon family, that, and it showed Americans too, that the Chinese, while there are obvious differences, were also people too. I mean, I know that goes without saying, but you have to understand, guys, that during the Cold War, the way that Americans and the Soviets, or Americans and the Chinese saw each other, was not the way we see each other today, right? So yeah, so guys, this was a historic breakthrough, and ultimately, guys, what it did is it led to the Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev, inviting the American president, President Nixon, to the nation of the Soviet Union as well. So later on in 1972 is a good year for world peace. So in May of 1972, we see Nixon then go to the Soviet Union, and he spends a week there, just like he spends a week in China. Now, the Moscow summit, as it is known as, takes place in May of 1972. And this summit is more business than it is pleasure. While obviously there was like whining and dining and things like that that happened between the American delegation and the Soviet delegation, this delegation, it bared more fruit than did the summit between the Chinese and the Americans earlier in 1972. So we saw at this summit in Moscow a number of different issues spring or have agreements made upon them, such as there was agreements about space, there was agreements about the environment, and the most important, and this is question number 30, the most important of these agreements was the agreement towards nuclear arms limitation. And that is important. Again, guys, we said that during the era of détente, tensions go down over time. And one way to ease tensions is to reduce nuclear armament. So during this time, there were two very important treaties that were signed in the Soviet Union between Brezhnev and Nixon. And the first one was known as SALT I. SALT is an acronym, and it stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, right? S-A-L-T. And guys, what this did is they agreed to limit the production and the amassing of nuclear weapons. And again, this is good for world peace. We see a second SALT come later when Herbert Walker Bush comes to, or President George Herbert Walker Bush, when he comes to power after the presidency of Ronald Reagan. But yeah, this is good, right? Salt is good. Not too much salt, right? Too much salt. Sodium chloride is not good for you, but in this case, this salt is very, very good for you, right? It was good for the world. Now, the second treaty that was signed at this time was known as the ABM, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. When you combine SALT and the ABM, this has the world breathe a collective sigh of relief. Now, at the beginning of this video, you saw Uncle Ben from Spider-Man say, with great power comes great responsibility. And in fact, those words were used by President Richard Nixon as he gave an address to the American and the Soviet public while he was in Moscow in 1972. You would have seen that in the video clip you should have watched, right? With great power comes great responsibility. Talking about the responsibility of these Cold War leaders, right? The Americans and the Soviets, to try to disarm and bring the world back from the brink of nuclear annihilation. And then lastly, number 31, how was détente shattered by the Soviet Union, and why did they do this? So on Christmas Day 1979, the Soviet Union invaded the nation of Afghanistan. Why did they do this? Well, Afghanistan had a Marxist government. And again, it's the Cold War. This is a war of prestige, and you want to make sure your sphere of influence continues to be maintained or even hopefully grow. And with the possibility of this Marxist government in Afghanistan failing, that would mean the Soviet sphere would get smaller, and they didn't want this. So détente ended Christmas Day 1979 when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan becomes very important, right? Afghanistan, the war that ensues, is basically like the Soviet Union's Vietnam. It was an unwinnable war, and for the people of Afghanistan to stand up against the mighty Soviet Red Army was a pretty amazing thing. America got involved in the Afghanistan War by arming a group of rebels known as the Mujahideen, who are, to be honest, mostly, nomadic herdsmen and like farmers, right? Like goat farmers who lived in the mountainous areas of Afghanistan. And slowly but surely, the Afghanis, with American backing, whittled away the will of the Soviets to participate in this war. And one person in particular, whose name you might know, who was involved in this war, was a man by the name of Osama bin Laden. And we'll talk about that in the next chapter. All right, that's chapter 9, and we'll see you later. Peace as always.